On the morning of January 22nd, 1879, under the shadow of a sphinx-shaped mountain in the heart of Zululand, British scouts chased a small group of fleeing warriors into a valley. What they discovered there would shatter the confidence of the Victorian Empire and rewrite the rules of colonial warfare forever. Sitting in complete silence on the valley floor were 20,000 Zulu warriors, their shields glinting in the African sun, their assegais ready for war. Within hours, this discovery would unleash one of the most shocking military disasters in British history, a battle where the most advanced firearms of the industrial age would face the traditional spears of Africa in a clash that defied every expectation of European military superiority. The massacre at Isandlwana stands as a monument to the deadly miscalculation of imperial arrogance. Here, beneath the towering cliffs of a remote African mountain, the myth of technological invincibility would be torn apart by warriors armed with cowhide shields and stabbing spears. This is the story of how 28,000 Zulu fighters, led by brilliant tactical minds and driven by fierce determination, would annihilate a modern British force in just 2 hours of savage combat. It is a tale of courage and catastrophe, of ancient warfare meeting industrial might, and of a single battle that would echo through the corridors of power from London to the kraals of Zululand. The roots of this disaster stretched back to the grand imperial ambitions that drove Victorian Britain to the furthest corners of the earth. In the smoke-filled halls of Whitehall, colonial administrators dreamed of a unified South Africa under British rule, a vast territory that would yield untold wealth from its gold mines and diamond fields. The architect of this vision was Sir Henry Bartle Frere, a colonial administrator whose experience stretched across the empire from India to the Cape Colony. Frere saw South Africa as a powder keg of racial tensions and competing kingdoms that threatened British interests at every turn. His solution was confederation, the forcible unification of all South African territories under the Union Jack. But standing in the way of this imperial dream was the Zulu kingdom, a military powerhouse that had dominated southeastern Africa for decades. Under the iron rule of King Cetshwayo, the Zulus maintained one of the most formidable armies on the continent, a force that could field tens of thousands of disciplined warriors at a moment's notice. For Frere, the Zulu military machine represented not just an obstacle to confederation, but an existential threat to British supremacy in the region. His paranoid mind conjured visions of Zulu impis sweeping across Natal, slaughtering white settlers and destroying everything the British had built. On December 11th, 1878, Frere delivered an ultimatum to King Cetshwayo that was designed to be impossible to fulfill. The British demanded that the Zulu king dismantle his entire military system within 30 days, surrender his most experienced generals for trial, and allow British officials to dictate the internal affairs of his kingdom. It was a deliberate provocation, crafted to provide legal justification for the war that Frere had already decided to wage. The ultimatum was not just an attack on Zulu sovereignty, it was a death sentence for a civilization that had been built on military prowess and warrior tradition. Cetshwayo, a shrewd politician who had spent years trying to avoid conflict with the British, found himself trapped between impossible choices. To accept the ultimatum would mean the complete destruction of Zulu independence and the reduction of his people to colonial subjects. To refuse would mean war against the most powerful empire on earth. For weeks, the king wrestled with the decision, consulting his advisors and seeking any possible diplomatic solution. But as the deadline approached, it became clear that Frere had left him no choice. On January 6th, 1879, the ultimatum expired, and the British Empire was officially at war with the Zulu kingdom. Lord Chelmsford, the commander tasked with bringing the Zulus to heel, was a veteran of colonial warfare who had earned his reputation in campaigns across India and Abyssinia. Confident in the superiority of British arms and training, he devised a strategy that seemed foolproof on paper. 3 columns of troops would invade Zululand simultaneously, converging on the royal capital of Ulundi, like the jaws of a trap. The plan was designed to prevent the Zulu army from concentrating its forces, forcing them to fight piecemeal battles against disciplined British formations, armed with the most advanced weapons of the industrial age. The centerpiece of British firepower, was the Martini Henry rifle, a technological marvel that represented the cutting edge of 1872 military engineering. This single-shot, breech-loading weapon could fire 12 rounds per minute in trained hands, delivering devastating 577 caliber bullets with deadly accuracy at ranges up to 400 yards. Each British soldier carried 70 rounds of ammunition, while reserve supplies waited in the rear to sustain prolonged firefights. Supporting this infantry firepower were mountain guns and field artillery, weapons that could shatter enemy formations at distances far beyond the reach of traditional African weapons. The British force that crossed into Zululand on January 11, 1879, was a formidable military machine by any standard. The central column alone numbered nearly 8,000 men, including 5 companies of the legendary 24th Regiment of Foot, mounted volunteers, native auxiliaries, and artillery units. These were professional soldiers, many of them veterans of campaigns in Afghanistan and India, men who had faced everything from Pathan tribesmen to Sikh warriors and emerged victorious. Their red coats and polished equipment spoke of imperial power, their disciplined ranks a testament to the military system that had conquered a quarter of the globe. But for all their technological advantages, the British forces suffered from a fatal flaw that would prove catastrophic in the battles to come. They advanced with the ponderous slowness of a European army, burdened by massive supply trains and hampered by cautious tactics better suited to the battlefields of Europe than the open grasslands of Africa. In 10 days of marching, Chelmsford's column had covered barely 10 miles, establishing fortified camps each night and sending out reconnaissance patrols that moved with textbook precision but glacial speed. The Zulus, by contrast, moved with the fluid grace of a people born to warfare. Their army was not merely a collection of tribal warriors, but a sophisticated military machine that had been perfected over decades of conquest and refinement. Under the revolutionary leadership of Shaka Zulu in the early 19th century, traditional African warfare had been transformed into something approaching modern military science. The old throwing spears had been replaced by the iklwa, a short stabbing weapon designed for close-quarters combat. Cowhide shields had been standardized and marked with regimental patterns that allowed for complex tactical maneuvers. Most importantly, the age grade system had been militarized, creating regiments of warriors who lived, trained, and fought together with an esprit de corps that rivaled any European unit. The iklwa itself was a masterpiece of practical weapon design, a tool that reflected the Zulu understanding of battlefield psychology as much as metallurgy. Its broad, leaf-shaped blade was ground to razor sharpness and mounted on a short hardwood shaft wrapped in hide for grip. Unlike the throwing spears of traditional African warfare, the iklwa was designed for intimate combat, for the moment when warrior met warrior at arm's length. The weapon's name came from the sucking sound it made when withdrawn from a wound, a grim testament to its lethality in skilled hands. Complementing the iklwa was the isihlangu, the large cowhide shield that served both defensive and offensive purposes in Zulu combat doctrine. These shields, standing nearly 5 feet tall, were not merely protective devices but integral parts of a weapon system that had been perfected through generations of warfare. A skilled warrior could use his shield to hook an enemy's weapon, create openings in his defense, or simply batter him into submission before delivering the killing thrust with his spear. The Zulu military system organized these weapons, and the men who wielded them into a force that combined traditional African tactics with innovations that would not have been out of place on European battlefields. Warriors were grouped into age-based regiments that lived in military kraals for months at a time, drilling in the coordinated movements that made their famous battle formations possible. The bull's horns formation that would prove so devastating at Isandlwana required not just individual courage, but collective discipline of the highest order. The chest of the bull formation consisted of the main body of veteran warriors, men in their prime who would advance directly toward the enemy and engage them in frontal combat. These regiments bore the brunt of enemy fire, absorbing casualties while maintaining their advance through sheer determination and numerical superiority. Their role was to fix the enemy in place, to draw their attention and firepower, while the real killing blow was prepared on the flanks. The horns were composed of younger, faster warriors who would sweep wide around the enemy flanks in a double envelopment that had proven devastatingly effective against rival African armies. These men moved with the speed of antelope across the broken ground, using every fold in the terrain to mask their approach. Their mission was not just to attack the enemy's sides, but to complete the encirclement, cutting off any possibility of retreat and turning an orderly withdrawal into a massacre. Commanding this intricate tactical ballet was a generation of Zulu generals who understood their enemy's strengths and weaknesses with startling clarity. Nashingwayo Kamahole, the overall commander of the Zulu force, was a veteran of dozens of battles who had spent years studying European military methods. He knew that British firepower was devastating at long range, but became less effective as the distance closed. His strategy was simple in concept, but fiendishly difficult in execution. Absorb the initial volleys, close the distance as quickly as possible, and overwhelm the thin British line through superior numbers and ferocity. The Zulu intelligence network had been tracking British movements for weeks, reporting every detail of their slow advance into Zululand. Native scouts, some of them serving in the British colonial forces themselves, carried word of enemy dispositions back to the main Zulu army. This information allowed the Zulu commanders to position their forces with surgical precision, using the broken terrain around Isandlwana to mask the movement of 24,000 warriors. On the night of January 21st, 1879, the main Zulu army reached the Ngwebeni Valley, a natural amphitheater hidden from British observation by a series of low ridges. Here, in the traditional manner of their ancestors, the warriors performed the ritual preparations for battle. Medicine men moved through the ranks, sprinkling protective charms and calling upon the spirits of fallen heroes. War songs echoed across the valley as regiments recited their battle honors and rehearsed the movements that would carry them to victory or death. The British camp at Isandlwana, meanwhile, lay spread across the plain in a formation that violated every principle of colonial warfare that experience had taught the Imperial Army. Lord Chelmsford, convinced that the main Zulu force was miles away, had split his command, taking nearly half his men on a wild goose chase after phantom enemy forces. The remaining troops, under Colonel Henry Pulaine, were left to guard a camp that stretched for over a mile without proper fortifications or concentrated defensive positions. Pulaine himself was a competent administrator but had never commanded troops in battle. His experience lay in the comfortable world of garrison duties and paperwork, not the harsh realities of colonial warfare against an enemy that moved like lightning and struck with the force of a thunderbolt. When reports began filtering in of Zulu movements in the surrounding hills, he dismissed them as minor skirmishes with scouting parties, never imagining that the entire Zulu army was massing just beyond the horizon. The fatal discovery came at 11 o'clock on the morning of January 22nd, when a troop of Natal Carbineers pursuing a handful of Zulu cattle raiders crested a ridge and found themselves staring into the Ngwebeni Valley. The sight that greeted them defied comprehension. Arranged in perfect silence across the valley floor were rank upon rank of Zulu warriors, their shields forming geometric patterns of black and white cowhide, their assegais glinting like a forest of steel in the morning sunday. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the two forces simply stared at each other across the divide that separated the industrial age from the warrior traditions of ancient Africa. Then, with a roar that shook the very ground beneath their feet, 20,000 Zulu warriors rose as one and began their advance toward the British camp. The great gamble was about to begin. The Zulu advance unfolded with a precision that spoke to years of training and an understanding of battlefield dynamics that European military theorists were only beginning to grasp. Despite the surprise of their early discovery, the various regiments formed their attack formation on the run, their movements coordinated by a system of horn calls and battle cries that carried across miles of open ground. The chest moved forward in a steady, implacable advance, while the horns began their wide sweeping movement around the British flanks. Back at Isandlwana, the first reports of the approaching enemy were met with skepticism and confusion. Officers trained in the formal warfare of European battlefields struggled to comprehend the scale of what was approaching. Estimates of enemy numbers varied wildly, from a few hundred raiders to several thousand warriors. It was not until the dust clouds on the horizon began to resolve into distinct formations that the true magnitude of the threat became apparent. Colonel Pouline, faced with a tactical situation far beyond his experience, fell back on the standard procedures that had served British forces well in previous colonial campaigns. He ordered his men to form an extended firing line, maximizing the firepower that could be brought to bear on the advancing enemy. Companies of the 24th Foot took their positions along a front that stretched for nearly a mile, their red coats bright against the African grass, their Martini Henry rifles loaded and ready. The two 7-pounder mountain guns were wheeled into position and loaded with case-shot, deadly anti-personnel rounds that would turn each cannon into a giant shotgun capable of cutting swaths through attacking infantry. Artillery crews, veterans of campaigns across the empire, checked their equipment one final time and prepared to demonstrate the devastating effectiveness of modern firepower against traditional warriors armed with spears and shields. As the range closed to 800 yards, British officers raised their field glasses and began to grasp the true nature of what they faced. This was not a raid or a demonstration, but a full-scale assault by the entire Zulu army. Regimental battle standards could be seen advancing through the dust, their distinctive patterns marking units that had fought and conquered across southern Africa. The ground itself seemed to writhe with movement as thousands of warriors advanced in formations that maintained their cohesion despite the broken terrain and the growing intensity of British fire. At 400 yards, the order rang out along the British line. "Company, present arms!" The metallic click of rifle bolts echoed across the plain as over 1,000 Martini Henry rifles were brought to the ready position. "Take aim." The long barrels swung toward the advancing mass of warriors, each weapon targeted at the center of the Zulu formation. The moment had come to test industrial firepower against traditional courage, to see whether technology could triumph over determination and numbers. The command to fire cracked like a whip across the African morning. Fire! 1,000 rifle muzzles erupted in a rolling thunder that echoed off the cliffs of Isandlwana. The first volley struck the advancing Zulu formation with devastating effect, cutting great gaps in the front ranks as warriors tumbled to the earth. Smoke billowed across the battlefield, acrid and choking, as British soldiers worked their rifle bolts with mechanical precision, ejecting spent cartridges and sliding fresh rounds into the chambers. For those first crucial minutes, it seemed as though European military science would triumph, as it had so many times before. The Zulu advance staggered under the weight of concentrated rifle fire, warriors falling in windows as the deadly 577 caliber bullets found their marks. The mountain guns added their voice to the chorus of destruction, case shots scything through the ranks of attackers with horrific efficiency. British officers, their confidence restored by the familiar sight of enemy casualties mounting, began to believe that this would be another routine colonial victory. But the Zulus did not break. Despite losses that would have shattered any European formation, the warriors maintained their advance with a discipline that stunned their opponents. When men fell, others stepped forward to take their places. When gaps appeared in the line, they were filled immediately by reserves moving up from the rear. The great chest of the bull formation absorbed punishment that defied belief, its warriors driven forward by a combination of military training and cultural imperative that British officers could barely comprehend. The tactical genius of the Zulu battle plan now began to reveal itself. While British attention focused on the frontal assault, the horns of the formation swept wide across the broken ground, using every fold in the terrain to mask their movement. These younger warriors, freed from the burden of absorbing enemy fire, moved with the fluid grace of men born to the hunt. They flowed across the landscape like water, seeking the weak points in the British position with an instinct honed by generations of warfare. As the range closed to 200 yards, a new sound began to penetrate the din of battle. It was the war cry of the Zulu nation, a deep-throated roar that rose from 20,000 throats in perfect unison. "Usuthu," they chanted, the battle cry that had echoed across a dozen conquered kingdoms. The sound was primal, terrifying in its intensity, and it began to affect the morale of soldiers who had never faced an enemy quite like this. The British firing line, stretched thin across nearly a mile of front, began to show the strain of sustained combat. Rifle barrels grew hot from constant firing, and the acrid smoke of black powder fouled the air so thickly that visibility dropped to mere yards. Soldiers found themselves firing into a grey haze, aiming at muzzle flashes and the occasional glimpse of shields and spears through the murk. The careful volleys of the opening moments gave way to individual fire as men loaded and shot as fast as their training would allow. It was then that the first ominous sign of disaster began to manifest. Runners sprinted back from the firing line, carrying messages that chilled the blood of every officer who heard them. "Running low on ammunition, sir." The word spread through the camp like wildfire, creating a crisis that no one had anticipated. The British had prepared for a short, sharp engagement against a traditional enemy. They had not prepared for a sustained firefight against warriors who refused to acknowledge defeat. The ammunition wagons, parked behind the main camp according to standard procedure, suddenly became the most important tactical positions on the battlefield. Quartermaster James Pullen found himself besieged by desperate requests for fresh supplies, as company after company sent runners back with empty pouches and urgent demands for more cartridges. The system that had worked so well in previous campaigns began to break down under pressure it had never been designed to handle. Worse still, the ammunition boxes themselves became a bottleneck that threatened to strangle British resistance. Each wooden crate was sealed with brass screws that required tools to remove, a security measure designed to prevent accidental explosions during transport. But in the heat of battle, with Zulu warriors closing to spear-throwing range, there was no time for the careful procedures that peacetime regulations demanded. Soldiers smashed at the boxes with rifle butts and bayonets, desperately trying to reach the cartridges inside, while enemy fire cracked overhead. The first breakthrough came on the British left flank, where the Natal native contingent had been positioned to extend the defensive line. These colonial auxiliaries, armed with obsolete weapons and lacking the training of regular troops, began to waver as Zulu pressure intensified. Unlike the British regulars, they understood exactly what defeat at the hands of the Zulus would mean. They had seen the aftermath of other battles, the ritual disembowelment that awaited the defeated, the complete annihilation that was the price of resistance. When the left horn of the Zulu formation finally burst from concealment behind a rocky ridge, the sight was too much for nerves already stretched to the breaking point. Hundreds of warriors appeared as if from nowhere, their war cries echoing off the cliffs as they swept toward the exposed flank of the British position. The native contingent, faced with the choice between death and flight, chose the latter. They broke and ran, streaming back toward the camp in a panic that left a 300-yard gap in the defensive line. Into this breach poured the left horn of the Zulu army, their assegais gleaming as they fell upon the exposed flank of the 24th Foot. The British soldiers, trained to fight in line formation against enemies who would meet them head-on, suddenly found themselves attacked from the side and rear. The careful discipline that had sustained their fire began to crack as men turned to face new threats, only to expose themselves to attack from other directions. Colonel Durnford, arriving with reinforcements just as the crisis deepened, made a desperate attempt to plug the gap with his mounted volunteers. These colonial horsemen, armed with carbines and accustomed to mobile warfare, represented the only reserve available to counter the Zulu breakthrough. But they too were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the assault, forced to give ground as warriors swarmed around their position like angry bees. The collapse, when it came, was sudden and total. One moment the British line was holding, maintaining a steady rate of fire despite mounting casualties and dwindling ammunition. The next, it was disintegrating as Zulu warriors poured through multiple gaps, their battle cries mixing with the screams of dying men and the crash of overturned equipment. The careful formations that had sustained British colonial warfare for decades dissolved into chaos as soldiers found themselves fighting individual battles for survival against an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. Hand-to-hand combat erupted across the length of the British position as Zulus closed to within stabbing range of their traditional weapons. The iklwa, designed specifically for close-quarters fighting, proved devastatingly effective against soldiers trained for long-range warfare. British bayonets, awkward and unwieldy at such intimate range, were no match for weapons that had been perfected through generations of tribal conflict. The camp itself became a slaughterhouse as Zulu warriors swept through the tents and supply wagons, cutting down anyone they encountered. Cooks, grooms, and camp followers who had never expected to fight for their lives found themselves facing warriors whose very culture was built around the art of war. The systematic nature of the Zulu advance, their ability to maintain tactical coherence even in the chaos of close combat, spoke to a military tradition that European observers had consistently underestimated. Individual acts of heroism shone through the carnage like beacons in the darkness. British officers, trained from childhood in the ideals of duty and sacrifice, stood their ground even as their world collapsed around them. They formed desperate squares with the handful of men still under command, fighting back-to-back against overwhelming odds with a courage that earned the grudging respect of their enemies. Some covered their faces, unable to watch death approaching. Others raged against fate, continuing to fire their revolvers until the ammunition ran out, then drawing their swords for one last futile gesture of defiance. The rout, when it finally came, transformed what had been a battle into a massacre. Those British soldiers still capable of movement began streaming away from the camp toward the Buffalo River, the same waterway they had crossed with such confidence just 11 days before. But there would be no safety in retreat. The Zulu military system, perfected through decades of warfare against fleeing enemies, was designed to pursue and destroy defeated foes with ruthless efficiency. Young warriors, their blood singing with the excitement of victory, pursued the fleeing British across miles of open country. Their fitness, honed by years of warfare and hunting, allowed them to run down mounted men whose horses were already exhausted by the morning's fighting. One by one, the survivors were caught and killed, their bodies adding to a trail of carnage that stretched all the way back to the Natal border. The sun set that day on a field of unimaginable carnage. Of the 1,700 men who had defended the camp at Isandlwana, fewer than 60 Europeans survived. The flower of British colonial forces lay scattered across the African plain, their red coats darkened with blood, their modern rifles silent forever. In just 2 hours of savage fighting, the Zulu nation had achieved what no European power had imagined possible: the complete annihilation of a British field force, using weapons that dated back to the Iron Age. The disaster sent shockwaves through the corridors of power in London. Politicians who had dismissed African warfare as primitive savagery were forced to confront the reality that courage and tactical brilliance could triumph over industrial might. The myth of European invincibility, built on decades of colonial conquest, lay shattered beneath the cliffs of Isandlwana alongside the bodies of the 24th Foot. But perhaps the greatest lesson of this blood-soaked day was not about the failure of technology or the limits of imperial power. It was about the price of arrogance, the cost of underestimating an enemy simply because they fought with different weapons and followed different traditions. The Zulu warriors who swept across that battlefield were not primitive savages, but sophisticated soldiers fighting for their homeland with a tactical system that had conquered half of southern Africa. Isandlwana stands as a testament to the truth that victory in war belongs not to the side with the best equipment, but to the warriors who combine courage with intelligence, who understand their enemy as well as themselves, and who are willing to pay any price for the cause they serve. In the shadow of that sphinx-shaped mountain, spears triumphed over guns, and the lesson echoes still across the centuries.